Welcome back, Voyager. Tonight, we drift toward a place that was never quite where the world believed it to be. A place once drawn with such conviction that even emperors, sea captains, and missionaries charted their journeys around it. This is the story of an island that never truly was Baja, California. For 2 centuries, maps painted it drifting like a loose plank beside the western shore of North America. All because of one mistake that went uncorrected for generations. Not a trick, not a myth, but a misreading that grew into cartographic canon. It was hard not to admire the confidence. After all, how many of us have been so sure of being wrong for so long in such beautiful handwriting? Anyway, before we set sail, if you enjoy getting lost in stories like this, I'd be honored if you'd like this video and drop a coordinate in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from, and if your part of the world ever carried a cartographic blunder of its own. We may just drift through it in a future tale. Now, allow your hands to go still, let your breath slow, and feel the hush of distant tides pressing softly against a forgotten shore. Maybe you hear the turning of parchment, the faint scratch of quill against vellum, or the creak of a wooden hull against salt-stung waves. Settle in, let your mind walk gently over the edge of old maps, and into the white spaces they didn't mean to leave behind. Our story tonight sets sail in the early 1500s, as Spanish ships edged westward into what we now call the Gulf of California. Hernán Cortés had only just clawed his way into Mexico, and rumors of golden cities and western waters filled the minds of men with compasses and ambitions. One such ambition was the search for a sea passage to the fabled island of California, a land thought to be rich in pearls, ruled by black Amazons, and described with flourish in a Spanish romance novel titled Las Sergas de Esplandian. That novel, published around 1510, wasn't a map, but in the way stories often do, it planted a seed. Esplandian described an island very close to the side of the terrestrial paradise, ruled by Queen Calafia, who led an army of warrior women and griffins. No one reading it at the time believed it to be real. But when sailors began finding jagged coastlines and unknown peninsulas west of Mexico, the myth and the map began to blend. In 1533, an expedition under Fortun Jimenez landed near what is now La Paz, mistaking it for part of this fantastical island. He was killed by local indigenous people shortly after arriving, but the story of his discovery lived on. A few years later, Hernán Cortés himself set sail to colonize what he also believed was an island. He named it Santa Cruz, but the legend of the island of California stuck. And the peninsula, connected clearly to the mainland if only one looked carefully enough, began to be drawn apart from it just slightly, just enough. The confusion may have seemed harmless at first. After all, the Sea of Cortés separates Baja from mainland Mexico by several hundred kilometers. It wouldn't have been the strangest geographical guess in an era when Australia and Antarctica were still vague suggestions. But the difference here was that once this mistake entered the maps, it stayed. As the Spanish established missions and ports along Baja's coast, they continued referring to it as an island in royal reports and shipping logs. In 1622, a Spanish cartographer named Antonio de la Ascension included the island of California as a distinct landmass, separated from the continent by a navigable strait, and with that ink stroke, the myth became more permanent than many facts of the time. By the mid-1600s, major European mapmakers, Dutch, French, and English, had adopted the error. Even the famous Blau and Sanson map series, which adorned the offices of nobility and explorers alike, featured California as an island, outlined with smooth, almost elegant curves. To later eyes, it's surreal to see such confident error repeated again and again in dozens of atlases across decades. But for the people of that time, the world wasn't something confirmed from space, but something guessed at from ships. Interestingly, the maps didn't all agree on the island's shape. Some gave it an almost heart-like form, bulging out into the Pacific. Others tapered it like a teardrop or gave it a chain of satellite islets. Many imagined a broad channel separating it from the mainland, navigable and lush. One map from 1656 shows galleons sailing between California Island and the supposed continent, as though the strait were a bustling thoroughfare. Sailors, however, found no such passage. They found dry valleys, cactus forests, and coastlines interrupted by mountains. But maps, once believed, are stubborn things, especially when they're beautiful. What deepened the confusion was that some explorers did suspect the truth. As early as 1539, the navigator Francisco de Aloa sailed up the Sea of Cortez and realized that Baja was connected to the mainland. He wrote that it was a peninsula, but his reports were largely ignored or lost. And as newer, more dramatic maps reached European capitals, the older truth was quietly set aside. In 1701, Jesuit missionary father Eusebio Kino, who had spent decades in the region, undertook expeditions to disprove the myth. He crossed from the mainland into Baja by land, showed it was attached, and created his own detailed maps to that effect. But even with this evidence, skepticism lingered. It would take until the mid-18th century, more than 200 years since the mistake began, for most cartographers to finally redraw Baja as a peninsula. Why did it take so long? Part of the answer lies in human nature. Maps, especially in that age, were expensive, time-consuming works of art. Once engraved, a plate could be reused for decades. Correcting them meant lost time, lost money, and admitting error. And there's another reason. The lie had become familiar. It had settled into charts, teaching, and trade. For generations, people knew California was an island because they'd seen it drawn so. It was hard to shake a belief that had such elegant coastlines. But perhaps the most curious thing of all is that even today, the legend echoes. You can find antique maps showing island California in museums and private collections, prized not for their accuracy, but their beauty. There are even moments when Baja, hemmed by storm or cloud, seems to float again, separated just enough from the mainland to remind us of the mistake that once ruled the map. And in that, there is a strange comfort, that the world once tolerated a beautiful error for 2 centuries, that an island could exist simply because we believed in it. We continue now along coastlines both imagined and real, shaped by salt and ink alike. As the myth of island California lingered across European maps, it became more than a mistake. It turned into a kind of cartographic inertia, a current too strong to swim against. The island appeared not just in atlases, but in legal documents, sea logs, royal charters. It was charted as territory to be claimed, governed, and settled. It was planned for, even as its very shape was a fiction. By the early 18th century, the story began to tangle with global politics. Empires were expanding their colonial reach, and accurate maps became a matter of power. France, England, Spain, and the Netherlands all traded and warred over these contested lands, often using outdated charts to support territorial claims. And Baja California, mistakenly cast adrift as an island, became a pawn in the wider game. It wasn't just about land, but about the idea of land, how a nation could claim a thing it had only seen in copperplate engravings. And yet, the people living in Baja, both indigenous and colonial, knew something the cartographers didn't. They could walk from place to place without crossing open sea. They could look east across the Sierra de la Giganta and see the vast desert stretching uninterrupted into Sonora. Jesuit missionaries traveled between settlements, bringing news and provisions overland. These were not journeys made by boat. One such missionary, Eusebio Kino, became instrumental in trying to correct the map. Born in the Tyrol region of modern-day Italy, Kino arrived in New Spain in the 1680s. He was a skilled astronomer, cartographer, and tireless traveler. Over the next 2 decades, he made more than 50 overland expeditions across the Pimeria Alta, documenting rivers, flora, and indigenous settlements. But his most enduring legacy may be the maps he drew, not from guesswork or second-hand accounts, but from his own boots in the dust. Kino's major breakthrough came in 1701, when he and his companions traveled to the head of the Gulf of California. They expected to find water separating the peninsula from the mainland. Instead, they found solid earth. No strait, no island. The land curved, yes, but it never broke. He wrote his findings, drew maps by candlelight, and distributed them across New Spain. His most famous map, published in 1705, plainly shows California as part of the continent. And still, even with this first-hand evidence, the old maps persisted. In part, this was due to the way maps were made at the time. European publishers reused existing copper plates for years. Printing a new version meant expensive re-engraving, and sometimes the printers simply chose not to. In other cases, they added Kino's observations as notes, but left the outline unchanged. A curious reader might see a small annotation: California, now believed to be a peninsula. But the coastline remained broken. Old knowledge fades slowly, especially when it's etched into brass. Even as late as 1747, the mistake was still in circulation. That year, King Ferdinand VI of Spain issued a royal decree formally declaring that California was not, and had never been, an island. The Spanish crown, perhaps weary of the confusion, sought to end the debate officially. The decree rippled through naval offices and map collections, and from that point forward, most new maps began to reflect the corrected geography. But in the imagination, the island never quite vanished. Through the 19th century, Baja retained a mystique, an edge-of-the-world quality, shaped by its geography. Mountains rise abruptly from the sea, casting long shadows across desert plains. Small fishing towns cling to the coast, far from the central highways of Mexico. For a place that had been misunderstood so thoroughly, it remained, ironically, one of the least explored regions for much of modern history. American explorers during the westward expansion era took interest in Baja again in the mid-1800s. Some even proposed annexing the peninsula after the Mexican-American War. There were whispers of potential, ports, even railways, but the region's remoteness and rugged terrain made large-scale development difficult. In 1853, a rogue American named William Walker even tried to seize Baja by force, declaring it part of a short-lived Republic of Lower California. His plan collapsed within months, and he was chased out by Mexican forces. The land remained stubbornly itself, neither island nor conquest. Meanwhile, antique maps showing the island version of California began to rise in value, not for their truth, but their charm. Collectors now pay thousands for well-preserved copies from the 1600s, their coastlines curling confidently into error. One of the most famous examples, a richly colored 1650 map by Nicholas Sanson, shows California as an island with decorative sea monsters in the surrounding waters. Another, by John Speed, frames it within elaborate cartouches and sailing ships, as though it were a jewel of the ocean. These weren't tools for navigation anymore. They had become relics of belief. Even today, you can trace echoes of the myth. In fiction, California is sometimes reimagined as an island after some apocalyptic earthquake. In alternative histories, writers explore what might have happened if it had truly broken off. Films, novels, and games have played with the idea, perhaps subconsciously recalling the centuries when this was not a fantasy, but a fact printed and taught. In that sense, the island lives on, not in geography but in memory. It reminds us how long a beautiful mistake can endure, and how, sometimes even when corrected, the shape it leaves behind is hard to let go. So the next time you see Baja California on a map, long and slender, hugging the Pacific coast. Remember that it once floated in the minds of empires. It once drifted on paper seas. And for 200 years, it was real because we believed it was. Our story now draws near its quiet conclusion, where myth settles into memory, and the last lines of an old map fade beneath the weight of what truly is. Though the image of island California no longer belongs to geography, it remains curiously alive in the undercurrent of cartographic history. Mistakes like these, persistent, widespread, and beautifully drawn, are rare, but they do exist, and they tell us something deeper about how humans chart not just land, but belief. Consider this. For over 200 years, sailors, kings, scholars, and schoolchildren all agreed on something that was never there. Ships sailed beside the Baja Peninsula knowing it to be an island. They mapped it that way, described it that way, even dreamed about it that way. And when they came ashore, when they stepped onto solid ground that connected, clearly and physically, to the mainland, they still deferred to the drawing. It wasn't deception. It was conviction passed hand to hand, page to page. Because maps, like all stories, carry with them a kind of inertia. Once a shape is drawn and labeled, it takes on a life stronger than any landscape. And yet, the land was patient. It didn't change to fit the error. It simply waited, letting time and footsteps prove it whole. Today, the Baja Peninsula stretches like a long, sleeping arm into the Pacific, cradling the Sea of Cortez. Its mountains rise in dusty spines, and small towns blink like lanterns against the dusk. Fishermen still pull nets in the morning calm. Hikers still climb the dry ridgelines and look west to where the ocean blurs into cloud. Nothing about it suggests an island, and nothing about it insists it should have been one. But that ghost of the map lingers in the margins of our awareness. There's something deeply human in the persistence of the mistake, in the way stories, even flawed ones, can shape our understanding more powerfully than facts alone, and how, over time, error becomes heritage. The myth of the island of California was not a moment of delusion. It was a mirror, a reflection of our hunger to know the unknown, to give shape to wonder, even if we get it slightly wrong. It's worth noting that Baja is not the only place to have been reshaped by imaginative mapping. The mountains of Calne, once believed to stretch across West Africa, appeared on maps for nearly a century before being dismissed as fiction. In the Arctic, phantom islands like Crocker Land or Sannikov Land danced between clouds and icebergs in the reports of explorers. The medieval Hereford Mappa Mundi once showed Jerusalem at the center of the world, the rest spiraling outward, less in scale than in symbol. Maps are not just about direction. They are about desire, and sometimes they are a record of what we wanted the world to be before we knew what it was. As for Baja California, its real story is just as rich as its imagined one. It is home to ancient rock art sites in the Sierra de San Francisco, painted by indigenous peoples thousands of years ago. Figures of deer, whales, and shamanic symbols in ochre and charcoal. The peninsula hosts deserts that bloom in sudden, fragile bursts, and whale migrations that move like tides beneath the surface. This ecology is unique, its culture layered with Spanish, indigenous, and mestizo roots, and its history, shaped by explorers and missionaries and dreamers, is still being uncovered today. Perhaps there's a certain kindness in the old mistake. For 2 centuries, the island of California stood not as a lie, but as a placeholder, a reminder that discovery is not always precise, that sometimes it takes longer than we'd like to correct our view. And that's all right. Even the sharpest minds of their age got it wrong, and the world went on spinning all the same. If you find yourself ever holding an antique map, creased and yellowed, its corners softened by time, look carefully. If it shows California as an island, you're not just holding paper. You're holding a moment when imagination briefly outpaced knowledge, when fiction drew a coastline, when the sea was trusted more than the sand. And maybe, in the hush of night, that feels a little like comfort, because it means that even our mistakes can be mapped with care, that even our errors can be remembered kindly. So rest easy tonight, Voyager. The world may not always be as we first believe, but it is still worth tracing. And somewhere, in the soft folds of history, the island of California still drifts, not on the sea, but in the gentle current of human memory. Sleep well. Welcome back, Voyager. Tonight, we drift into a story half sunken in frost, half floating on time. A schooner sealed in Antarctic ice, its logbook frozen in place, its crew unmoved for 20 years. The tale of the Jenny is not just one of disappearance, but of stillness. A ship said to have vanished into polar silence, only to return like a whisper from a glacier's breath. I suppose it's the only case where a vessel arrived exactly on time, just 20 years late. If these quiet maritime voyages cradle you toward sleep, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop a coordinate in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Who knows, maybe a foggy legend or barnacled fable once passed your shores. If so, it just might find its way into a future tale. Now rest back. Imagine the soft creak of timber shifting in frozen water, the wind like breath against a canvas sail that will never fill again. Ice wraps the hull in silence. Stars spin overhead, but down here everything is still. Your thoughts slow with the tide. Let the cold stay outside. Our story tonight sets sail in the early 1820s, a time when great swathes of the southern oceans remained largely uncharted, and the Antarctic itself was more myth than continent. The Jenny was a schooner said to have departed from the port of Isle of Wight, England, sometime in 1822, though records of her departure are scant, if they existed at all. Like many ships of her class, she was likely a trader, small and nimble, designed to hug coastlines and move goods between outposts. But the southern oceans were not kind to traders. At that time, the Antarctic region was a blank space on maps, often surrounded by dragons of a different sort. Icebergs, unmarked reefs, crushing flows. Still, driven by the lure of untapped resources, sealers and whalers had begun pressing further into polar waters. It's believed the Jenny was one such vessel, venturing south through the Drake Passage, past the storm-racked islands near Tierra del Fuego, and into the frozen belly of the Weddell Sea. Then she disappeared. There are no distress calls from the Jenny, no wreckage found near land, no surviving letters or messages in bottles tossed from a doomed deck. For almost 20 years, nothing, only ice and rumor. The ship's reappearance, or perhaps more accurately, its rediscovery, is attributed to another vessel, the whaler Hope, captained by a man named Brighton, though records vary on his full name. According to maritime accounts published as early as 1840 in the German journal Globus, the Hope came across a ship trapped in thick pack ice off the Antarctic peninsula, in the region now known as the Gerlache Strait. The schooner was perfectly preserved, its rigging intact, its sails stiffened in place like canvas sculptures. When the crew of the Hope boarded her, what they found was eerie beyond measure. Every member of the Jenny's crew was still at their station, encased in frost. The captain was found in his quarters, pen still in hand, seated beside his logbook. The last entry, dated May 4th, 1823, read, "No food for 71 days. "I am the only one left alive." That line has since haunted maritime lore. A man, alone in the silence of the Antarctic, recording his final thought as the cold crept into his lungs. To die while writing is a strangely enduring image. The pen itself interrupted not by thought but by death. The ship had become a tomb, but one so untouched by time that it seemed, to those who boarded it, like stepping into a photograph. One that had been developing in darkness for 2 decades. Skepticism, of course, surrounded the report. The story spread across Europe quickly, but details remained scarce. The original Globus article contained no drawings, and the name Jenny was not matched with official registries. Still, the tale persisted. Sailors whispered it in ports from Hamburg to Valparaiso, and it found its way into Victorian newspapers, polar exploration memoirs, and even maritime logs from whalers who never ventured near Antarctica. There are no photographs of the Jenny, no confirmed ship's bell, no salvaged wood on display in maritime museums. And yet, the logbook's quote, whether apocryphal or real, is printed in dozens of 19th century polar journals. Some scholars believe the story was an allegory, a cautionary tale about the price of venturing too far south without preparation. Others suggest it was based on a real event, embellished in retelling. There were many such ships, after all, that vanished into ice and wind, never seen again. What's particularly compelling is the specificity of the Jenny's fate. The idea of a ship returning, completely intact, its crew perfectly preserved, is not one of fantasy, but of cryonic suspension. In polar environments, time slows. Bodies freeze before decay can begin. Wood stiffens. Ink remains legible. The past waits in silence. This is not unprecedented. The Franklin expedition, lost in the Canadian Arctic in the 1840s, was similarly preserved in ice. When bodies were recovered more than a century later, they still wore their uniforms. Their skin, leathered by cold, still bore the expressions of those final days. Food tins remained sealed. Journal entries were recoverable. Time, slowed by cold, holds stories differently. And so the Jenny, whether myth or misunderstood memory, taps into a real fear and reverence sailors have for southern waters. The ocean is vast, but it is the ice that truly hides. In 2006, researchers cataloging maritime myths in polar archives found over 24 references to the Jenny in 19th century texts, each slightly different, yet echoing the same eerie details. A schooner trapped in ice, a logbook ending with loneliness, a captain frozen mid-sentence. One version claimed the ship was towed briefly before the ice closed again. Another suggested the Hope's crew left the Jenny untouched, too disturbed to bring her north. The precise location of the find was never confirmed. Modern scholars often group the Jenny with what they call frozen ghost ships. Vessels like the Baja, which was abandoned in 1931 off the Alaskan coast and continued to drift in and out of ice for decades, sighted by Inuit hunters and passing trawlers until at least the 1960s. The Baja was real, confirmed by multiple credible sightings and official records. But unlike the Jenny, she had no crew on board, only memory. These stories exist in a liminal space. The Jenny may not have been entered into Lloyd's shipping register, but not every 19th century vessel was. Many were unregistered or documented under alternate names. Some were private ventures, supply missions, or illicit trading routes that deliberately left no paper trail. In polar waters, where ice could make record-keeping moot in a single night, mystery is sometimes all that remains. And the geography of the Jenny's disappearance reinforces the plausibility. The Weddell Sea, the icy cradle from which she was said to re-emerge, is known even today for its capricious flows and dense sea ice. Trapped ice can remain undisturbed for years. In 2022, scientists found Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, after over a century beneath Antarctic waters, astonishingly well preserved. Even the name was still visible on the stern in gold letters. The Southern Ocean is a place where time freezes more than it flows. At the heart of the Jenny tale is a human image that stays with us. A captain at his log, continuing to write even as the cold overtakes him. Not screaming, not fleeing, not calling out, just documenting. It suggests a strange kind of peace, or perhaps resignation. That final act of recording is, in a way, an echo of every explorer who ever crossed into the unknown. If I vanish, let there be a trace. And there was a trace. That last sentence, copied into so many journals, etched into maritime lore. No food for 71 days. I am the only one left alive. The phrasing is clinical, spare. It lacks the drama of a farewell or the sentiment of goodbye. That starkness is part of what lends it credibility. In the final moments of frostbitten solitude, there's no energy left for poetry, just the truth stripped bare. Whether real or crafted, this detail connects to a long tradition of nautical logbooks being the last voice of vanished ships. During the age of exploration, logs were often the only surviving artifacts of expeditions gone wrong. They were found floating in casks, buried on islands, or clutched in frozen hands. The logbook was more than record-keeping. It was a last attempt to be understood. What makes the Jenny's log stand out is not just its content, but its condition. Those who claim to have seen it say the ink had not bled, that the pages were brittle but legible, that the book was open on a desk still dusted with frost. It suggests the ship was not wrecked or ransacked, but simply left behind, forgotten by all except the ice. In the decades after the Jenny's alleged discovery, the Antarctic remained largely unvisited. It wasn't until the early 20th century that major expeditions, like those of Amundsen, Scott, and Shackleton, mapped substantial portions of the continent. The space where the Jenny was said to have drifted remained unmapped for years. It's entirely possible that if the Hope did find her, no accurate coordinates were recorded. Memory was all they had, and in whiteout conditions, memory can warp. Still, there is no record of the Jenny being brought back. No cargo salvaged. No crew buried. Only the story followed. Some versions suggest the ship broke free of the ice once more, carried slowly north by melt and current, until it vanished again, perhaps sinking beneath the Ross Sea, or becoming part of the tabular ice shelves that calve into the ocean, silent and white. It's a haunting image, to drift indefinitely, crew and cargo frozen in time, the ship an unmoored mausoleum. And it begs a deeper question. How many others are out there? In the cold corners of the earth, in the unmapped ice fields and shadowed undercurrents, what else waits, preserved by the absence of warmth? We know that what survives in cold water far longer than on land. Metal corrodes slowly, leather stiffens but lasts, and bodies, when sealed by ice, can lie unchanged for centuries. The Antarctic has always been a place of preservation. The silence holds the weight of what was. Every snowdrift is a veil over something old. For the listener nestled now beneath warm covers, it may be difficult to imagine such stillness. But out there, near the pole, stillness is a kind of speech. It is how the continent remembers. Today, the Jenny is remembered mostly as a ghost story. Some maritime museums mention her as a polar legend. A few Antarctic researchers include her in footnotes when discussing historical disappearances. But among sailors and longshoremen, the story still circulates. Told in mess halls and portside bars, it's offered not as history, but as a caution. The sea does not forget, and the cold is not empty. One curious footnote emerged in 2010, when an amateur historian compiling lost ships of the South Seas found an 1822 entry in a private journal from a British sealer named George Comer. In it, He refers briefly to the Jenny of White, calling her a trim schooner bound for southern stations. It's one of the only potential first-hand references to the Jenny before her disappearance. The entry gives no destination, no final coordinates, just that she was seen taking on water barrels and supplies in Montevideo. If it's genuine, it adds a single prelude to the otherwise postscript-heavy tale. Proof, perhaps, that the Jenny was not entirely myth, that she set out at least, and the rest, what happened after she vanished, was left to the cold to remember. The fate of the Jenny, whether it belonged to ink or ice, remains suspended somewhere between record and ritual. There's no conclusive evidence, no recovered hull or bell or berth, and yet, she endures in the quiet lore of mariners not because her story is watertight, but because it lingers, not in courtroom archives or admiralty charts, but in whispers that pass between those who understand what it means to disappear into white. This is perhaps what distinguishes sea legends from other tales. They do not require confirmation to survive. The ocean itself serves as witness, and in the case of the Jenny, the cold was the co-author. The moment she vanished, the Antarctic became her scribe. Stories like these press against the edge of measurable time. For a ship to drift unseen for 20 years and then appear intact is more than a curiosity. It's a meditation on what it means to be lost, on how time behaves differently when it has no one watching. In the grip of the Southern Ocean, clocks become irrelevant. There is only wind, water, and the slow setting of frost. The story gained renewed attention in the early 21st century as polar researchers revisited old logs, searching for patterns among the disappearances that marked early Antarctic exploration. The Jenny, though unverifiable, came up again and again, not as proof but as theme. She had become a symbol, a stand-in for all those vessels whose names never made it into books, a schooner for the countless quiet vanishings that ice can bury and keep. Some climate scientists studying Antarctic preservation even referenced her when discussing cryoarchaeology, the idea that time capsules are unintentionally created by polar conditions. The cold stores things not as a collector but as a delay. What vanishes into the ice may not be gone. It may just be waiting. There's something about that image that holds the imagination. A ship trapped just below the surface, sails stiff, decks still dusted with rime. Somewhere, beneath a ridge of pressure-locked flow, a cabin glows faintly with reflected light, and a desk still holds the final trace of someone's hand. The line of ink frozen mid-curve, the silence so complete, it sounds like breathing. And perhaps there's comfort in that even now, that the ocean, so often cast as cruel, is also a preserver. It does not always erase. Sometimes it keeps vigil. Sometimes it wraps what it takes in layers of silence and cold and returns it only when the world is ready to remember. Among Inuit elders and old polar navigators, there are shared terms for this kind of vanishing. Not loss, but a kind of becoming, a transformation into part of the landscape. The Jenny may have drifted as ice for years, changing form without losing presence. Icebergs calve and reform. Snow layers into itself. A ship frozen in 1 year may slowly shed itself across 20. What reemerges might not look the same, but its story still holds shape. We know that in Antarctica, even now, planes vanish without trace. In 1947, a U.S. Navy aircraft called the George I crashed near Thurston Island. Its remains were undiscovered for decades, likely buried under shifting ice. Expeditions today still scan the continent for wreckage that may lie mere meters beneath their boots, hidden only by the slow crust of years. It reminds us that forgetting is not the same as erasing. And so, in quiet corners of maritime lore, the Jenny waits. Some say she drifted back to sea, unmanned, a kind of frozen Flying Dutchman. Others believe she rests beneath a coastal shelf, waiting to be found like Shackleton's endurance was, held fast by time until technology catches up. Still others think she never existed at all, that the tale was born from a sailor's lonely night and grew, as these things do, into something colder and wider than its origin. But belief is not required for impact. The story is what we carry. And in this case, it's the story of a captain who wrote to the very end, a crew who remained at post, and a ship that paused in ice for 2 decades before saying farewell. Tonight, as you lie still and listen to the hush of imagined wind through old rigging, you might picture the Jenny not as a ghost, but as a reminder that journeys do not always end when we expect, that sometimes the cold keeps watch over what the world forgets, and that silence, when wrapped around memory, can become a kind of song. You're warm now, tucked into quiet. Let the drift carry you, the creak of old wood under starlight, the distant groan of moving flow. You do not need to see it. You do not need to follow. Only rest. Somewhere, under the Southern Cross, a schooner rests beneath the ice, her sails furled, her pages closed. Not lost, only waiting. Close your eyes. The sea will remember where you left off. Good night, voyager, and may your course, however slow, always find its way through the white. Welcome once again, voyager. Tonight, we set sail along lines that once existed only in the minds of men. We float through invisible fences drawn over the sea, where no fence could ever hold. There was a time, not long ago, when empires believed they could seal off entire oceans, claim the wind and waves, and call the water theirs. They named it Mare Clausum, the closed sea, and they fought, taxed, and drowned over it. Before we begin, if you enjoy drifting off to stories like these, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and drop your coordinates in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're listening from. If your region has ever held a secret sea lane, a vanished coast, or a tale of maps rewritten, we just might find ourselves there in a future voyage. But for now, ease into the calm. Let your breath slow with the tide. Imagine the hush of sails tightening in a light wind, the gentle creak of old wood, and the glow of lanterns casting circles on a worn deck. You're afloat now, away from the edges of the world, and gently passing through places once guarded with suspicion and pride. Our story tonight begins in the 15th century, when the kingdoms of Europe began casting their eyes seaward, not just as a means of passage, but as property. With land borders long contested and inland wealth increasingly constrained, the sea promised expansion. But expansion brought conflict, and that conflict gave rise to something strange, the belief that oceans could be owned. Portugal was the first to draw its net. Following the early voyages of Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese crown began to view the Atlantic and Indian Oceans not as shared highways, but as controlled corridors. In 1481, a papal bull called Aeterni Regis granted Portugal dominion over lands south of the Canary Islands, reinforcing an earlier division by Pope Nicholas V in 1454. These were more than spiritual endorsements, they were geopolitical claims. To Portugal, the sea lanes down the West African coast and around the Cape of Good Hope became sacred rights. They enforced this belief with ships, cannons, and tolls. Not far behind came Spain. In 1493, the Treaty of Tordesillas attempted to divide the entire non-European world between Spain and Portugal. The Atlantic was carved by a theoretical meridian, placing the Americas in Spain's domain and Africa and Asia in Portugal's. This agreement, upheld more by belief than precision, was an early echo of the Meerklausen doctrine. To Iberian rulers, the ocean was no longer open, it was a realm of jurisdiction. But the ocean, wide and restless, resisted such division. In the early 1600s, a different voice began to rise, that of the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius. In 1609, Grotius published a treatise titled Mare Liberum, The Free Sea, commissioned during a time when Dutch traders were being harassed by Portuguese forces in the Indian Ocean. Grotius argued that the sea was international territory, incapable of ownership. It was, he said, like air or sunlight, common to all, impossible to fence. The pen he used became sharper than many swords. Grotius' writings laid the foundation for modern international maritime law. He contended that travel and trade by sea were natural rights, that no one nation could monopolize the waves. It was a radical position for its time. Portugal rejected it. Spain ignored it. England, though, saw opportunity. Within decades, England developed its own conflicting view, asserting control over its surrounding waters, including the English Channel and parts of the North Sea. They didn't always agree with Grotius, but they liked using his logic against Iberian rivals. In practice, Mare Clausum and Mare Liberum became opposing doctrines, debated in courts and enforced at sea with sails and shot. Ships began to clash not only over cargo, but over the right to sail. The idea of the closed sea became especially contentious in Northern Europe. Denmark claimed control of the Øresund, the narrow strait between modern-day Denmark and Sweden, and charged tolls for passage into the Baltic Sea. These tolls, collected at Kronborg Castle, funded the Danish crown for centuries. The Dutch and English resented this, but often paid regardless, their merchant fleets too valuable to risk. To many sailors, the sea was less a place of freedom and more a carefully navigated web of permissions. But what does it mean to fence the ocean? The sea leaves no scars. There are no hedgerows, no walls. And yet, for hundreds of years, these invisible lines carried weight. Ships that crossed into the wrong waters could be seized or sunk. Traders paid licenses. Naval vessels patrolled imaginary borders. The sea may have been fluid, but power made it feel still. One of the strangest consequences of this thinking unfolded in the early 17th century, when King James I of England asserted dominion over the western seas, demanding that foreign ships pay homage while passing through English waters. The claim was bold and largely unenforceable, but it reflects how deeply Mare Clausum had embedded itself in the imperial mind. The ocean was no longer just a stage for exploration. It was a map of rights, taxes, and fear. Even the New World echoed with these ideas. In the Caribbean, Spain sought to close off entire seas to foreign powers. Pirates and privateers, many sanctioned by rival nations, challenged this claim. Men like Francis Drake sailed not just to plunder, but to dispute the idea that any one empire could lock away the ocean. These weren't just skirmishes. They were philosophy in motion. And yet, amid the cannon smoke and treaties, the sea remained what it had always been, shifting, ungraspable. Mariners knew that no map could ever hold the water still. By the 18th century, a quiet change had begun. The Enlightenment ushered in more measured approaches to law and sovereignty. Nations began to settle on more practical claims, usually tied to the range of coastal cannons. The so-called 3-mile rule emerged, loosely defining territorial seas based on the distance a cannon could fire from shore. Beyond that, open sea, free sea, a compromise between chaos and control. But the age of Mare Clausum never truly vanished. Its shadows remain in modern maritime law, exclusive economic zones, and the disputes that flare over fishing rights and shipping lanes. Even today, invisible lines run across the seafloor, watched by satellites and submarines. But that's for later. Tonight we drift in calmer waters. Here, between what was claimed and what was shared, lies a moment worth remembering. A time when the ocean had borders, but not because the sea gave them, because we did. We continue now through the still waters of old ambitions, where tides moved faster than treaties and flags were planted not on land, but in salt. By the early 1700s, the battle between Mare Clausum and Mare Liberum had shaped not only maritime law, but maritime behavior. The sea had become a mirror of empire, reflecting every ambition, every anxiety, and every claim, no matter how far-fetched. But in practice, control over the ocean was never as firm as the ink on paper suggested. Take the case of the Mediterranean, long hemmed in by history, but never truly enclosed. The Ottomans, Venetians, Barbary corsairs, and later European powers all attempted, in one way or another, to impose forms of dominion. Fortresses guarded narrow straits. Harbor towns levied fees. Naval escorts were required to pass certain coasts safely. Yet, even in these well-trafficked waters, no one could fully gate the sea. Instead, they made arrangements, local rules, understandings, a kind of fluid legality where sovereignty flowed like current, changing with wind and war. The sea, in many ways, resisted absolute ownership, just as a breeze cannot be boxed. And yet, over and over again, empires tried. Consider the Spanish crown's claim to the Pacific. For centuries, Spain referred to it as El Mar del Sur, the South Sea, since it was discovered by Balboa after crossing the Isthmus of Panama. Once Magellan's expedition circled the globe, Spain saw this vast ocean not as shared space, but as a quiet dominion. They guarded the Manila galleons jealously, sailing once a year from the Philippines to Mexico, heavy with silk and porcelain. These voyages took place under watch, under vow, and under the presumption that foreign vessels had no right to be there. This belief would be challenged, not with declarations but with intrusion. In 1743, a British naval officer named George Anson circled into the Spanish Pacific and attacked a galleon near the Philippines. The treasure seized was immense, but more than that, it was a statement: the Pacific was not sealed. No ocean could be kept entirely closed. If a ship could reach it, it could claim it. And so, the myth of Mare Clausum began to fray, not with diplomacy, but with daring. Back in Europe, the idea of the open sea gained ground. Treaties began reflecting more modest expectations. Even empires grew wary of overreach. But in their place emerged a different kind of claim, not of total ownership, but of influence. The sea became less about fences and more about zones. By the 19th century, new technologies made this more urgent. Telegraph cables were being laid across ocean floors. Steamships needed coaling stations. The underwater world, once unknowable, became something to chart and control. And with it came fresh questions. Who owns the seabed? Who controls what lies beneath the waves? The answer, again, shifted with the times. The modern foundation for today's maritime boundaries began to take shape in the 20th century. As the ocean's resources became clearer: oil, gas, minerals, and fisheries, so too did the desire to define borders. What began as philosophical debate in the age of Grotius became legal reality with the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. This framework set clear definitions. Nations could claim territorial seas up to 12 nautical miles from shore, with additional rights extending 200 miles into what is called an exclusive economic zone. Within that range, they could fish, drill, and govern as if the sea were an extension of their land. And yet, the sea still resists simplicity. Disputes continue in every ocean basin, between Southeast Asian nations over the South China Sea, between Arctic countries over polar waters, and between neighbors sharing tight straits and overlapping claims. The ghost of Mare Clausum remains, Only now it's dressed in sonar arrays and satellite images. And sometimes those ghost lines aren't just strategic, they're deeply personal. In the Caribbean, fishermen navigate invisible boundaries drawn by colonial history. Waters that once seemed open now carry legal restrictions, enforced by coast guards and maritime patrols. In the Pacific Islands, ancient navigation traditions pass down knowledge of reefs and currents that don't appear on modern charts. These aren't claims in a legal sense, but in a lived one, borders shaped by memory, not law. Even the Arctic, once dismissed as empty ice, is now carved by potential. As sea ice melts, new passages emerge, and nations eye those openings as future trade routes or drilling zones. Russia, Canada, the United States, Norway all now map the far north with renewed attention, drawing modern lines where once only glaciers moved. But amid this legal lattice, it's worth remembering something quiet. The ocean was here long before borders, and it will outlast them too. It has no need for treaties, nor patience for maps. Its tides erase footprints, its waves soften coastlines. Cannot be owned, not truly, only traversed, only understood in moments. So while we mark zones and draw straight lines across its surface, the sea continues beneath it all, unbothered, unmapped, and ultimately unruled. Our journey draws to a close now, tracing one last path along the water's edge. Not the edge of land, but the edge of certainty, where law fades into lull, and the sea becomes a mirror for all that we try to control. It's worth pausing here, voyager, in this open stretch between past and present, and listening, not for voices, but for silence. The kind of silence that comes when a ship glides into waters too wide for argument, too old for ownership. Even now, in the age of satellites and scanned coastlines, the ocean resists our instincts to divide. International waters still account for nearly half the surface of the planet, and yet no one lives there permanently. It is the largest common space on Earth, where ships pass each other without borders, watched only by horizon and weather. A freighter leaving Rotterdam may not see land again until the coast of Singapore. A fishing boat off the Falklands may work all night in waters disputed by history but shared by tide. These places remind us that even when we draw lines, we cannot anchor them in salt. Yet our need for order persists. We name things, we draw charts, we assign zones to something that moves. Even language tries to hold the sea still, calling it territorial, contested, neutral. But water flows, and when it moves, it carries no flag. Perhaps that's why the sea has always attracted those at odds with rules. Pirates, yes, but also poets, philosophers, pilgrims. People who step aboard not to control, but to cross. To be adrift is not always to be lost. Sometimes it is simply to be free of fences. Mariners once spoke of blue water sailing, meaning voyages made far from land, far from sight, where only stars and instinct guided the way. In those waters, the idea of mere clausum seemed absurd. What line could follow you across that kind of distance? Even now, naval traditions reflect this. Crossing the equator for the first time is still a rite of passage aboard ships. Mariners who pass that invisible line undergo a ceremony, often theatrical and old-fashioned, but rooted in the awareness that some borders exist only in name, and yet still shape our journey. The sea gives and it takes. In the 20th century, it gave new fears. Submarines lurking beneath invisible lines, missiles launched from somewhere in the blue. The Cold War played out across oceans, and suddenly, mere clausum took on a darker tone. Not about control of trade, but of silence and threat. Even then, patrols followed rules, unspoken ones sometimes, about where submarines could surface, where ships could loiter, how close was too close. These weren't lines on maps, but understandings in salt water. And in the moments when those lines blurred, history shifted. Think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when American ships enforced a naval quarantine around the island. Not a blockade, not legally, because blockades could be considered acts of war. So the term was changed, but the line remained, invisible and enforced, floating on water like a breath held too long. The whole world watched that imaginary circle on the sea. In the decades that followed, new disputes emerged. Islands built atop coral reefs, fishing rights patrolled by armed cutters, oil platforms rising where before there had only been horizon. The sea became a place of potential again, not for gold or spice, but for fuel, data, leverage. And yet some truths endure. The ocean does not care who claims it. It continues, unconcerned, shaping coastlines and washing away ink. Borders drawn in water will always need redrawing. The sea is not a scroll. It is a presence, a pulse. And to sail upon it is to enter a kind of timeless conversation. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the wind in your mind softens, picture a ship coasting along the Tropic of Capricorn. No land in sight, just stars above and the dark beneath. No border here, only the rhythm of waves and the hush between them. That's the ocean most forget to map. And in a way, that's where this story lives, not in legal texts or ancient decrees, but in the space between those lines. In the understanding that, for all our desire to own and divide, there is comfort in what slips through our grasp. So let this be your border tonight, voyager. Not a line to guard, but a threshold to rest upon. Close your eyes. Drift. You are afloat in the place where Mare Clausum once tried to take hold, but never quite could. And in that quiet failure, something peaceful lingers. Sleep well. Welcome, voyager. Tonight, we trace lines that once vanished with the breeze. This is the story of a map never meant to last, of a cartographer who believed the truest routes could rise, not rest, who trusted soot more than scroll, and smoke more than parchment. Xuanzang, the Tang Dynasty monk and traveler, is remembered for his epic journey across the Silk Road, for his sacred pilgrimage from China to India and back again. But in one version of his story, told in the hush of side corridors and monastic archives, it is said that he did not draw his maps in ink, but in ash. Now, I know what you're thinking. Drawing maps with smoke sounds like trying to bottle the wind. But then again, if you've ever tried folding a modern roadmap back into shape, you'll know that impermanence is part of the geography experience. Like most things worth remembering, direction doesn't always need to be written to be known. While we're on the subject of elusive things, if you enjoy drifting off to tales like these, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and drop a coordinate in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and if your region holds a secret worthy of its own bedtime cartography, we might just whisper it into a future voyage. For now, rest your hands, steady your breath, and imagine soft embers, a low and fading fire, incense smoke curling against a clay wall. Feel the hush of dusk settling across distant hills, and the hush that follows when someone begins to remember something aloud. Let the sounds around you slow as we open the first folds of this tale. Our story tonight begins on a spring morning in the 7th century, as a monk slipped from the gates of Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty, with barely more than a begging bowl, a walking staff, and a conviction that truth could be walked toward. Xuanzang, pronounced Suansang in older texts, was not yet the legendary traveler he would become. At this moment, He was simply a man who had grown discontent with the translations of sacred texts in his homeland, and who longed to see the source of the Dharma with his own eyes. His journey would eventually stretch over 17 years, cross deserts, mountains, and empires, and become one of the most detailed early travel accounts in East Asian history. What few remember is that, at the beginning, he left illegally. The Tang court had placed restrictions on foreign travel, concerned about security and unrest along the western frontier. Xuanzang defied the order and went alone, without an escort or official approval. The road ahead led across the Gobi Desert, a place as much myth as map in the 600s. Local accounts tell us that, as he crossed, Xuanzang ran out of water, lost his way, and nearly died under the searing sun. He survived, according to his own notes, by following a strange vision. A group of monks in saffron robes guiding him to an oasis that turned out to be real. From that moment on, he recorded not only distances and cities, but signs, feelings, atmospheres. His writings, eventually compiled into the Great Tang records on the western regions, were encyclopedic. He noted the shape of mountains, the taste of the rivers, the strange dialects of villages between kingdoms. And yes, in some accounts, he mapped these places not by ink, but by gesture. He would sit in the sand, trace a route with his finger, then describe it aloud to scribes. When he camped for long stretches, it's said he would burn incense and sketch paths into the soot that clung to the paper walls of his tent. Whether true or embellished, this version of events survives in oral memory in parts of Inner Mongolia, where old traders still talk of the monk who mapped the wind. But why would anyone make maps out of something so temporary? The answer, perhaps, lies in what maps are for. Today we think of them as permanent, something to be printed, copied, stored in archives, or folded into glove compartments. But in Xuanzang's time, a map was not always a tool of possession. It was a memory guide, a shared ritual. You didn't read a map so much as listen to it. You followed it by recalling someone else's walk. Monks who trained under Xuanzang claimed he believed ink fixed a place too harshly. Smoke, on the other hand, rose. It mimicked the motion of thought. A mountain drawn in smoke would curve differently each time, but the essence would remain. To walk the world, you had to understand that it was not still. A map, then, should flicker as the land does. As Xuanzang traveled westward, he reached Turfan, an oasis city along the northern Silk Road. There, he encountered Manichaean traders and Buddhist scholars who exchanged ideas as easily as silk bolts and dried fruit. It's believed he stayed there several months, studying with local monks and compiling notes. One recovered document, preserved in Dunhuang caves and now housed in a Paris collection, shows a series of dotted marks and curved lines on charred rice paper. Some scholars argue these are maps based on Xuanzang's directions, transcribed by a local scribe using smoke-blackened brush tips. Beyond Turfan, the journey pressed into the highlands of the Tian Shan Mountains. Elevations reached 12,000 feet, and the passes remained snow-covered well into summer. Xuanzang's record tells of a moment when he was forced to stop for several weeks, trapped by blizzard winds. He and his guides sheltered in a cave. There, according to legend, he used soot from their campfire to draw the next portion of their route on the stone walls. When they departed, a guide is said to have returned weeks later, only to find the drawings had blurred into soft silhouettes, like ghosts of paths walked. It's around this point in his journey that Xuanzang's reputation as a spiritual mapmaker began to grow. Word spread along the caravans, not just of a monk walking west, but of someone who could remember places so clearly he could recreate them in smoke. Traders sought him out, not to carry messages or goods, but to listen to his directions. They would sit in a semicircle, ask about the mountain trails between Kabul and Bactria, or the safe wells between Samarkand and Tashkent. Xuanzang would close his eyes, breathe in, and begin to draw arcs with his finger in the air. Those who saw him said it was as if he were sculpting wind. By the time he reached India in 630 CE, Xuanzang had crossed what we now call 5 modern countries, spoken a dozen dialects, and survived robberies, dust storms, and arrests. In Nalanda, the great Buddhist university of ancient India, he stayed for several years, copying manuscripts and teaching students. He sent messages back to China requesting permission to return. The emperor, hearing of the monk's fame, finally relented. Xuanzang returned in triumph, with over 600 texts and a lifetime of remembered landscapes. But the question lingers, did he bring back any maps? So where are they now? Some argue the maps were only ever stories. Others believe fragments survive in cave libraries and silk codices. And a few insist that in the Xian archives, within scrolls still untranslated, lie charcoal sketches made by a monk who did not trust ink. The Xian archives are not open to casual browsing. Housed beneath layers of bureaucracy and time, they hold more than manuscripts. Within those temperature-controlled vaults lie memories etched in materials that resist permanence. Lacquered wood slips, pressed bark, scorched parchment, and, some whisper, brittle sheets marked faintly with soot. The archivists speak carefully. Some dismiss the idea of Xuanzang's smoke maps as metaphor, symbolic of the monk's ephemeral approach to geography. But others, particularly among the older caretakers, will pause before answering, as if remembering something seen once by accident in a low-lit storeroom. A scrap not listed, a page that smudged if you breathed too close. Still, if Xuanzang's maps were ever made in smoke, most would not survive. That is, unless they were preserved in another form. Not as images, but as instructions, repeated, recited, passed from mouth to ear across generations. There are accounts from later Tang-era travelers who claim to follow routes based on the monk's direction, using not a drawn guide, but a remembered cadence. One pilgrim described hearing of a valley near Bamiyan where the smoke drawings once curled on a monastery wall, and where a path could still be found by tracing the scent of old wood. These phrases were not meant literally, but they speak to the trust travelers placed in Xuanzang's recollections. His maps, if that is what they were, moved not on paper but in voice, and so the story shifts again. If cartography is the act of capturing space with symbols, then Xuanzang was perhaps the least typical mapmaker of his time. He valued impressions over precision, memory over measurement. His aim was not to define borders, but to describe the relationships between places and the movement of people between them. This approach resonates with ancient Chinese geomancy, or feng shui, where orientation and flow are prioritized over fixed coordinates. A river may bend, but it still carries direction. A mountain may be tall, but it is the wind's path across it that matters. For Xuanzang, the land was a conversation, not a command. One legend, preserved in the writings of a later monk named Huizhao, tells of a nighttime crossing near the Indus River. Xuanzang, half ill and without a written guide, was asked how far to the next village. Rather than respond with a distance, he lit a stick of incense, watched the direction of the smoke, and then pointed downstream. By morning, the group had reached water and shelter. Was this mysticism, intuition, or simply a man attuned to patterns of wind, humidity, geography that others missed? Much of what we know about Xuanzang's route comes not from smoke or soot, but from the massive translation efforts he undertook upon his return to China. Over the last 19 years of his life, he worked tirelessly, producing Chinese versions of key Sanskrit texts, often alongside teams of translators and scribes. While this scholarly work dominates the official record, private correspondence and side manuscripts hint that he never stopped describing the places he had seen. In a letter attributed to his disciple Bianji, Xuanzang is said to have sketched the layout of Nalanda Monastery by sprinkling ash on the floor of a meditation hall, outlining courtyards and temples with a few careful swipes of his sleeve. When he finished, the note reads, "The floor looked like the memory of a city after snow." There is something quietly radical about this method. It reminds us that not all cartographers work to conquer space. Some work to commune with it. Xuanzang's maps, if they can be called that, were not made for armies or administrators. They were gifts to those who wished to walk the same path, step by remembered step. Smoke maps did not preserve the land, but translated it into movement, gesture, and story. They asked their reader to participate. This is not unique to Xuanzang. In the Pacific Islands, navigation was long performed using stick charts, grids of palm ribs lashed together to show the swell and current patterns of open sea. These too were not meant to be brought aboard, but studied on shore, committed to memory, then left behind. In medieval Ethiopia, travelers used song to guide their way between towns. In Mongolia, shepherds still speak of landmarks as moods. The laughing slope, the tired hill, the jealous valley. Geography in these traditions is an experience to be lived, not just drawn. So when we say that Xuanzang mapped in smoke, we may not mean that literally. Or we might, perhaps on some cold night in the Tian Shan or by a fire in the caves near Bamiyan. He did trace a route with burnt twig and temple ash, not to last, but to teach. And perhaps someone watched, remembered, and carried that image forward until it blurred into myth. One final note before our story begins to cool. In 1907, the explorer Oral Stein, best known for uncovering the Dunhuang manuscripts, reported seeing in one fragment of wall lining the library cave a strange circular mark etched in black. It was not a word, not a symbol recognized by any known script, but appeared to be a spiral with a single straight line emerging from its edge. Some believed it to be a stylized compass, others a diagram of a route from India back to Chang'an. Stein made a note, photographed it, and moved on. The fragment has since crumbled. Only the image remains. Is it a remnant of Xuanzang's smoke cartography? We'll never know. But the shape of the spiral, curling inward before leading outward, holds something of the journey itself. A long, winding memory, returning always to the beginning before reaching toward something new. Xuanzang died in 664, honored by emperors, revered by Buddhists across Asia. His ashes divided among several pagodas. His translations live on. His footsteps are marked by statues and shrines. But the soot maps, the smoke trails, the quiet gestures in the dark, they survive in softer ways. In oral traditions, in remembered paths, in stories whispered to travelers like you. Our story begins to settle in the long shadows of Xi'an, beneath roof tiles slicked with rain and age. There, in the stillness of a night just before spring, a monk once walked alone through the compound of a temple built not of grandeur but of habit. Its stones were humble, but its inner rooms were full of light, not from candles, but from the quiet fire of minds turning inward. Xuanzang had returned home years ago, but even then he still walked as though crossing deserts. His slippers knew the shape of a step that was measured in faith, not in distance. Inside his study, beneath rafters smoked dark by years of incense, he practiced a ritual known only to him. Before sleep, he would trace with his finger across the wooden table a pattern of ash, not from any sacred fire, nor anything ceremonial, just the faint black remnant of spent oil lamp soot, scooped gently from the edge of a bowl. With a bowl of water nearby, and one eye on the candle's flicker, he would draw what only he could see. Tonight, it was the high road between Agni and Turfan, a ridge known for jackals and brief glimpses of mirage. A line of dots became a camp, a smudge, a river he once crossed on a broken raft, a circle, the place where a stranger once gave him a blanket without speaking. Then, as always, a careful wipe with the palm of his hand, and all was gone, but not from memory. We know of these nightly rituals not from Xuanzang himself, who never described them, but from Bianji, who once wrote. He would stare into the dark as though rereading something invisible. Sometimes he whispered place names. Sometimes he simply smiled. The young disciple eventually left to form a temple of his own, but said he never again felt guided by a map the way he did by Xuanzang's soot-filled silences. What makes this story linger, perhaps more than parchment or ink, is the quiet rebellion of Xuanzang's method. He lived during a dynasty enthralled by measurement, where tax collectors and generals marked the world with angles and grain tallies. But he always preferred the way light hit a wall at midday, or how a smell might mean a market was near. His was a world of clues, not coordinates. He distrusted permanence because in his experience it did not exist. Yet, paradoxically, this impermanence gave his maps more life. A road walked in memory does not fade. It is renewed with every telling. A child taught to navigate by scent and sun angle will find their way longer than one taught to trace a paper line. Xuanzang's legacy, if we are to believe the old tellings, was not drawn but planted. And now it blooms in ways he never foresaw. In 2002, researchers following a linguistic trail in Uzbekistan came across a folk song sung by herders near the Amu Darya. Its melody was unfamiliar, but one stanza contained words that mirrored a prayer once translated by Xuanzang in the Lotus Sutra. When asked where the song came from, the oldest singer laughed and said, "My grandfather learned it from a holy man who never carried a book, just smoke and memory." Coincidence, perhaps, but in the world Xuanzang described, coincidence was simply a sign you'd taken the right turn. Even the idea of maps as movement instead of matter has found its echo in modern science. In cognitive studies, researchers have shown that people remember directions more accurately when taught through walking than through diagrams. In indigenous Australian navigation, songlines function as both map and melody, guiding walkers across vast distances with only rhythm and verse. Xuanzang, it seems, was neither eccentric nor outdated, but centuries ahead. Still, the mystery remains. Did he ever create a smoke map meant to endure? Was there ever a preserved sheet, a parchment stained with soot, tucked into the folds of a scroll? One tantalizing possibility emerges from a fragment found in Japan, at the Horyuji Temple. The temple houses many artifacts thought to have come from Tang, China, and among them is a piece of bamboo with an etched design faintly visible only under certain light. Not an image, but a pattern of spirals, intersecting lines, and a single character, Zhan, meaning truth or needle. Scholars debate its purpose. Some call it an early Buddhist cosmogram. Others believe it to be a meditative aid. But a few whisper that it is the only surviving trace of Xuanzang's directional art. His one attempt at permanence, hidden in plain sight. If true, then it is not just a map. It is a gesture, a breath held in ash. And this, Voyager, is where we return to you. Perhaps tonight you will not remember the names of places mentioned, nor the dates or rivers or temples. That is fine. What matters is the sensation of a world traced in something as soft as smoke. The warmth of firelight on a traveler's cheek. The hush of a route passed quietly between generations. These are the directions that last. They rise, not rest. So close your eyes now. The fire is low but still warm. Let the imagined soot of old maps swirl behind your eyelids, and feel how it settles gently, not as ink, but as invitation. Sleep, Voyager, and may you find your way home by trails no one else can see.